I'm going to skip the part of the video where I trash on Amazon's half-assed attempt to turn Tolkien's masterpiece into their biggest corporate cash cow and celebrate its glorious failure. If you clicked on this video, I'm sure you're already familiar with this magnificent disaster, and odds are you hate it about as much as I do. But I never wanted Amazon to fail at adapting Tolkien's mythos, as the story they bafflingly decided not to tell in favor of their seemingly AI-generated fanfiction is actually incredible. That's what makes this lifeless parody of the fantasy genre so infuriating. But if you know me, you know I'm not content to ignore wasted potential. So I've spent more than my fair share of time asking what this show could have looked like if the creators had actually cared to treat the source material with the reverence it deserves. But before I get into it, you should know that I'm just thinking out loud. So if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. And to anyone who's been around the channel since I last talked about this show, sorry for the wait on this one. I actually wrote the skeleton for the script over a year ago, but it ended up sinking to the bottom of my unfinished projects bin, and for whatever reason, I only just recently felt inspired to dig it up again. So if it was worth the wait, please let me know. The engagement really does mean a lot. Oh, and a quick heads up, I'm going to be throwing a lot of lore at you, mostly assuming you know what I'm talking about. I'll try to keep it simple and offer enough explanations for you to follow along if you haven't read the Silmarillion in a while, but if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'd recommend checking out the lore channels linked in the description. Now without further ado, let's dive into what could have been Amazon's Rings of Power. First of all, let me clarify what exactly it is I'm doing here. As I'm sure you know, aside from its flaws as an adaptation, the writing in The Rings of Power is just incredibly amateurish on every level, and so I could make a decent video just running with the story's existing premise and trying to salvage something watchable from it. That might make for a decent imaginary show when judged on its own merits, but I'm a massive fan of Tolkien's writings, and I believe that adaptations, particularly adaptations of such incredible works of literature as this, have a responsibility to treat their source material with respect. So, since a lot of people defend the show by arguing that adapting the source material faithfully was never going to work, I wanted to make this video to prove those defenders wrong. The biggest hurdle the writers had to jump in the earliest stages of the show's creation was in figuring out exactly what story to tell. The events it chose to focus on were all those described and shown in the iconic prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring. However, the challenge is that those events didn't take place within a few years. Rather, they took place over the course of a few thousand years, a massive period of Middle-earth's history known as the Second Age. The writers could have approached this issue in a number of ways, but rather than choosing from any of the more intelligent options at their disposal, they just decided to take a highlight reel of events from a history on the scale of the Old Testament and cram them all into a single story without any significant time jumps. They might as well have made a show in which Abraham, Moses, and King David all lived at the same time. So what other choices did they have? Well, to simplify, they had two. First, they could still try to cover all the highlights of the Second Age by focusing each season on a different period of time. And second, they could pick one reasonably small period of history and focus on just the characters and events within it. I can imagine either option working out relatively well, but I find the latter far more interesting. So let's get the form out of the way real quick so we can spend the rest of the video on the story I would have told. The first option, a sort of anthology series spanning thousands of years, is the suggestion I've heard posited most frequently from Tolkien's fans, wanting to see all the same events Rings of Power sort of tried to adapt. Were we to go with this version of the story, I imagine it looking something like this. Season 1 would depict the forging of the rings and subsequent war of elves and Sauron, spanning a couple hundred years. Season 2 would show us the corruption of the Nazgul a few hundred years later. Season 3 would take place about 1,000 years after that, and would lead up to Sauron's surrender to Numenor. Season 4 would tell the story of the fall of Numenor over the next 57 years, and finally Season 5 would depict the War of the Last Alliance 100 years later. This would probably be a decent show and faithful adaptation, but a lot of these events might feel a bit rushed, and I don't think it's necessary to break up the seasons of the show across so much time to cover all the important events in one way or another. I think we could tell a single clear narrative in this show, with minimal massive time jumps and only a couple minor instances of timeline compression. And this is the version of the show that I've spent a ton of time fleshing out. So let's dive into it. This series is going to focus on just the final events of the Second Age, described in seasons 3 through 5 of the previous hypothetical version of the show. It's still going to take place over a large amount of time, but it'll be structured much like House of the Dragon, and follow the same few characters over the course of its overarching story. So who are these characters? Well, I imagine Elendil, Isildur and Elrond would be the story's primary POV characters across all 5 8-episode seasons, with others including Anarion, Ar-Pharazôn, and Miriel, as well as some non-Númenórean human characters we'll get to in a bit, playing prominent supporting roles as well. As you can guess, this series would focus primarily on the politics in Númenor leading up to its destruction, and then from there depict the War of the Last Alliance. Some earlier events might be folded over into this time frame, as you'll see, but I deliberately kept significant timeline changes to a minimum. And while the story of the Forging of the Rings is very important, it will be kept as backstory, frequently referenced and flashed back to the way the end of the War of the Last Alliance was in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Not only that, it will be presented as a bit of a mystery that will be revealed over the course of the first half of the show. Now with the premise established, let's jump into this unfortunately imaginary series and break it down one season at a time. Of course, the first episode has to start with an epic history lesson of a prologue. The first scene would open onto a truly epic shot of the War of Wrath. In the first few shots, we'd get glimpses of truly apocalyptic destruction, with dragons torching armies, gods tearing open and flooding the earth, and even a shot of Arendelle in his magic spaceship striking in Calagon out of the sky to crash down on the towers of Thangorodrim. If you know, you know. This would just be a brief montage of shots, only a minute or two long, but those shots would be truly cinematic, like something straight out of a Roland Emmerich movie. See, I don't imagine my version of the series spending as much money on special effects in its first season as the real Rings of Power did, so assuming it has the same budget, it would have a lot more money to pour into the first couple minutes of its prologue. This awesome intro would be accompanied by minimal narration explaining how, after centuries of darkness and terror, the Valar finally heeded the cries of elves and men, crossing the sea to drive the Dark Lord Morgoth from Arda once and for all. We would then see how the Edain, the few men who fought against Morgoth, who survived the war, were granted the island of Númenor to rule, and the elves were given the land of Eriador for their home. While I don't think the narration needs to name them or explain their relationship, I imagine we would see both Elrond and his twin brother Elros, and their relationship would be apparent, if nothing else by the fact that they'd be played by the same actor, before we see them part and Elros crowned king of Númenor. At this point, we're told there was peace in the western lands of Middle-earth for over 1,000 years, though Morgoth's shadow still shrouded the lands of men to the east. We are then told that a mysterious figure calling himself Annatar arrived among the elves, bringing gifts and teaching them arts they never before imagined. He was welcomed among them by all but the oldest and wisest of the elves, whose wariness proved well-founded. Annatar was revealed to be Sauron, a servant of Morgoth who sought to enslave the elves with his arts. His deception was discovered before his plan could come into effect, but in his wrath he destroyed the city of Eregion and waged open war against the elves. Only with the aid of the men of Númenor could they stand against his forces, ultimately driving him back to his stronghold in Mordor. Ever since, the elves and Númenorians have kept a watchful eye on his lurking power in the east, though men forget more easily than elves. Notice there was no specific mention of the rings. That was deliberate. See, for the first season, we're only going to know as much about Sauron as the Númenorians do, so he'll be a bit of a mysterious figure to our protagonists. From here, let me explain the first season's 3 major plotlines. The first, which takes well over half the screen time and contains multiple subplots within it, is the one in Númenor, which begins primarily focused on Elendil. Our story starts in the days of King Tar-Palantir, with political tensions rising as to who will be the ailing king's successor, since he never had a son. Candidates are vying for the hand of the king's daughter, Miriel, the most prominent among them being Ar-Pharazôn, an ambitious and highly charismatic figure who stirs the people in jealousy and distrust of both the elves and the Valar. The conversation surrounding the old king's impending demise has led many to express fear and even anger regarding their people's gradually declining lifespans, which Ar-Pharazôn is quick to capitalize on for his own agenda. Elendil, our main character, dislikes this rhetoric and begins to suspect Ar-Pharazôn of foul play in his aggressive pursuit of power. One last important character in this storyline I should mention before turning to the other two is a mysterious nobleman, one who has lived far longer than any Númenorian since the first of their nation's kings. There are actually 3 of these ancient noblemen, but one of them is most prominent here. For now, I will simply refer to them as the Elders. Their longevity and arcane knowledge has earned them a status of great reverence among the people, and they have deeply embedded themselves into the current political scene. With the Númenóreans losing their exceptional lifespans, these enigmatic individuals are looked to almost as saviors, and they have been extremely influential in turning the people against the elves and the Valar. They claim that these divine beings are selfishly hoarding the power of immortality so that they might demand worship from men, and they claim that the secrets of eternal life are free to all who can discover them. Ar-Pharazôn is a major supporter of the Elders, promising to give them greater power, including more official status within the government, and they advise him in his campaign. Of course, Elendil, as a traditionalist and worshipper of the Valar, detests these men and distrusts the source of their longevity, and he begins investigating their connection to Ar-Pharazôn. Now let's turn to the plotlines in Middle-earth, which depict the return of Sauron's power from two perspectives. One of these is the Elves, with Elrond serving as our primary POV character, but probably the one with more screen time is focused on some of my own invented human characters who live in the region adjacent to the White Mountains, which will later become Gondor. Because this plotline is focused on normal humans with normal lifespans, we'll probably follow multiple generations of characters in one family over the course of the show. In this story, we learn that this now relatively primitive and divided nation was once the center of a great empire, but that it was overthrown long ago, in large part thanks to two mysterious beings sent from the gods across the sea, who traveled into the east after helping overthrow the ruling dynasty of the empire. I'll leave the biggest nerds here to deduce who those could be. Among the tribal peoples living in the region now, there are some conflicting narratives surrounding their ancient history, with some seeing the days of the Empire as a dark time of oppression and sorcery, and others looking back to it as a glorious era to which they wish to return. We are introduced to the storyline from the perspective of a character who, for the sake of this video, I will simply name Bob. Bob is a child at this point, the young son, or maybe even daughter, of a somewhat powerful tribal leader, and his story starts when emissaries from the Great One, aka Sauron, arrive from the east, promising to unite their people into a great nation like the one that was destroyed long ago. Many tribes like the sound of that and begin to flock to Sauron's servants, but Bob's father distrusts them and fears to return to the oppression of a dark sorcerer who would use them for his own ends. As all this goes on, the elves grow uneasy to learn of Sauron's growing power over the nations of men to the east and south. Elrond, Galadriel, and Gil-galad counsel regarding the situation, and send messengers to implore Númenor to come to their aid in stopping this threat before it can mobilize against them. When this message is received, Ar-Pharazôn, at the urging of the elders, takes the opportunity to stir the people against these emissaries. He declares that this plea for help proves the elves are no greater than them, and do not deserve the reverence with which they've been treated. He argues that Sauron is no threat to them, and that they ought to let the elves fight their own battles, unless they are willing to recognize Númenor's superiority, bow to them, and grant them the secret to immortality. I imagine this would be the ending of the first episode, and would serve as the main inciting incident in this plotline, perhaps accompanied by one of Elendil's sons uncovering something deeply suspicious about either Ar-Pharazôn or the Elders. From there, we would begin to see the political intrigue in Númenor escalate, as Elendil seeks to catch and expose Ar-Pharazôn's plotting, as well as figure out the aims of the Elders and the source of their unnatural power. Miriel doesn't like or trust Ar-Pharazôn either, and tries to help Elendil expose him, seeking his help in turn as she plots and campaigns to succeed her father herself as Númenor's first female monarch. However, around the midpoint of the season, Ar-Pharazôn ends up somehow coercing her into accepting his marriage proposal, after having secretly assassinated the dying king before he could publicly name her his heir. Of course, this means he is ultimately crowned king in spite of all our hero's efforts, and Elendil is forced to begrudgingly bow to him. Around the same time, back in Middle-earth, Bob's father loses his war of resistance against those who side with Sauron, and he is killed, though he manages to give his child the chance to escape. I imagine these two major defeats both take place in Episode 6, which is followed by a time jump of about 10 years. In the final episodes, we learn that Sauron has been strengthening his forces since we last saw them, and is now moving against the elves of Eriador. We see the first assault, and the elves once more send word to Númenor seeking aid, again in vain. Elendil, furious at Ar-Pharazôn's spiteful refusal to fight their common enemy, begins plotting against him somehow, perhaps gathering his allies in preparation for a coup. However, his efforts are foiled when he is betrayed, and he and all his allies are rounded up and imprisoned. Fortunately, he manages to alert his sons, or else prepared them for this eventuality beforehand, and they evade capture. Side note, I know I've barely mentioned Isildur and Anarion before now, but they've been around and serving as active parts of the plot. While Anarion remains in hiding to organize a rebellion against Ar-Pharazôn, Isildur steals a ship to sail to Middle-earth and seek the aid of the elves in overthrowing the government. This is how the first season ends. Oh, and Bob, now an adult, is probably shown to still be alive, though I'm not sure what exactly to do with him for the next season, so I may just not mention him until we get to Season 3, though you can assume we'll occasionally cut to him to show what's going on with Sauron's forces until then. Season 1 had two main storylines, Elendil's first of all, and the one in Middle-earth supporting it, much like Dany's storyline in Game of Thrones. This season pushes those two back just a bit to let Elrond and Isildur take center stage. While Elendil sits in prison and Anarion does his best to organize their allies while evading capture, Isildur arrives in Lindon, perhaps via shipwreck, to seek the aid of the elves, and here, after some time spent traveling on everyone's part, he eventually meets his great-great-great-something uncle, Elrond, and from him learns about the forging of the rings. Not all at once, right at the beginning of the season, of course. In fact, I would show the audience how the rings came to be forged through a series of flashbacks from Elrond's perspective. Because Elrond wasn't directly involved in the forging, which took place in Eregion while he was likely spending much of his time in Lindon, we wouldn't be seeing too much of Sauron and Celebrimbor actually working together at this point. Don't worry, I'll get to that later. The focus here is on the elves in Lindon receiving reports from Celebrimbor on his work, Elrond learning from Gil-galad and Galadriel of their fears regarding Anatar's true nature and intentions, and of course, the secret forging of the 3 elven rings, and subsequent realization of Sauron's treachery and his forging of the One. These flashbacks are given across the space of the first few episodes, most of them before Elrond meets Isildur, but the last of them, in which Sauron's true plan for the rings is revealed, is given during a conversation between the two of them. See, Isildur tells Elrond what's been going on in Numenor, and Elrond becomes particularly interested in the Elders. When Isildur has told him all he knows about them, Elrond recounts the forging of the rings, and we then see in flashback how the elves learned of Sauron's deception, as well as witnessing the sacking of Eregion, in which Sauron reclaimed the rings he helped Celebrimbor forge. Elrond's point in telling all this, as it becomes clear to Isildur, is that it appears the Elders in Numenor gain their apparent immortality from 3 of the original 16 rings, which were given to them by Sauron, making them his agents. That's right, if you didn't piece it together a while ago, the Elders are among the Nazgul. As were the emissaries of Sauron uniting the nations of men in the other storyline back in Season 1, who are now generals over the armies marching on Eriador. If you know your stuff or have just been paying attention, you should know that I'm making my only significant timeline changes here to bring the Nazgul into the story before they became mere wraiths, but I feel it was justified. Following this conversation with Elrond, Isildur pleads with Gil-galad to help his family take back Numenor, promising that they will aid the elves in fighting Sauron if they do. However, Gil-galad argues that they can't afford to go to war with Numenor. Even if they could fight against Numenor's full forces, even if Elendil's allies were numerous enough to turn the odds in their favor, their interference would only harden the people loyal to Ar-Pharazôn against them. Besides, dividing their attention at this crucial time would leave them incredibly vulnerable to Sauron's approaching forces. Thus, the elves decline Isildur's plea, but they do help him get back to Numenor, perhaps sending him with something that will be of use to him in facing the Nazgul. But, perhaps most importantly, he now has critical knowledge that may help his family expose and overthrow their enemies. All of that I would consider Act 1. Act 2 would be all about Isildur reuniting with Anarion and them working together to expose the Nazgul to the people, and, perhaps more importantly, to Ar-Pharazôn. Don't ask me how they accomplish this, but suffice it to say they do, and the Nazgul flee Numenor. Elendil is freed from prison, and Ar-Pharazôn is extremely pissed at having been manipulated. Thus, he is very susceptible to Elendil stoking his ego by urging him to sail to Middle-earth to avenge his pride and go down in history as the king that brought down the Dark Lord Sauron. Also, over the course of Act 2, we saw the elves, led by Elrond, engaging in battle with Sauron's forces in Eriador. But we also saw the Dark Lord's armies marching west and south against Numenor's colonies, burning them as he claims all Middle-earth for his own. So naturally, Ar-Pharazôn can't let this challenge against Numenor's authority go unanswered. Thus, in Act 3, Numenor's forces assemble for war, and they sail to the mainland. If you know the lore, you know what happens next. Sailing up the Anduin, they lay siege to Mordor itself, anticipating a great struggle, but to their shock, Sauron himself comes out to meet them, and surrenders. Prior to this, I imagine we saw the Nazgul returning to Sauron from Numenor and reporting their failure, and he had a Thanos moment, going, "Fine, I'll do it myself," which the audience likely thought was him about to unleash hell, but which really meant he was going to tear Numenor apart from the inside, just as his servants were supposed to. Anyway, in the season finale following this shocking cliffhanger, Elendil doesn't trust Sauron and urges Ar-Pharazôn to end him right then and there, but the prideful king insists on parading his prize back to Numenor as a captive, which he does. The king triumphantly presents his prisoner to his people. Both Elendil's family and the elves ponder what the Dark Lord's plan is and how to stop it. And once Sauron is in prison, we see Ar-Pharazôn visiting him like some kind of zoo exhibit, at which point the not-so-helpless captive begins planting the seeds of flattery and deception in his captor. You know how I said that this show would be structured like House of the Dragon? Well, I was mainly referring to this season because it's got to cover the 57 years from Sauron's capture to the destruction of Numenor. This season will probably start several years after the end of the last one, and the first couple episodes will show Sauron, who has already gone a long way in ingratiating himself to Ar-Pharazôn, telling his unwitting puppet his sob story about being disgraced and vilified by the elves and the Valar for simply trying to create a better world for all. He reinforces the king's ideology that the divine beings are hoarding power, including immortality, for themselves. He convinces the king that his quest to destroy the elves and unite men under his benevolent rule is a righteous one, and he promises him that he could make him into a god king if he unites with him. By the end of the first couple episodes, Sauron has convinced Ar-Pharazôn to release him from captivity and make him his chief advisor. From there we get another time jump, this time of a couple decades. We see how bad things have gotten with Sauron in charge. Not only have the people come to renounce the Valar, they have openly turned to Melkor worship, with Sauron as their high priest. Over the next couple episodes, spanning a few years, we see Elendil and his children organizing their allies into a distinct political faction opposed to Melkor worship, known as the Faithful. We then have one more 20 to 30 year time jump right in the middle of the season, this one putting us within a couple months of Numenor's destruction. The next couple of episodes show political tensions escalating to open violence, with Melkor worship now involving human sacrifices, conveniently including the king's political opponents, Ar-Pharazôn speaking of open war against the Valar themselves, and the Faithful taking up arms against the Kingsmen in the streets. Episode 5 starts with Elendil having a vision of the impending downfall, which he believes came from the Valar. This leads him to plead with the Mad King to denounce his worship of Melkor and execute Sauron in order to save his kingdom from what's coming. For this treason, he is sentenced to death, but the execution is foiled when his sons lead an open revolt to free him. The Faithful come out bloodier than the Kingsmen, but they save Elendil, and an all-out civil war ensues. It is then that Sauron persuades Ar-Pharazôn to turn his talk of war against the Valar into action, in order to force his subjects to recognize his power and authority, promising him that setting foot on the Undying Lands will make him the immortal God King he needs to be to fulfill all his dreams and promises. At this point, let me back up a bit. In this season, Sauron becomes a major POV character, and we once again get flashbacks to the Forging of the Rings, but this time, they are spread throughout the season, perhaps one at the beginning of each episode, and here, they are from Sauron's perspective, focused much less on the rings themselves, and more on his relationship with Celebrimbor. This story would clearly parallel how Sauron is seducing and manipulating Ar-Pharazôn in the present narrative, playing on the pride and desire for greatness in both individuals, in both cases leading to cataclysmic destruction, though each story ends very differently, with Celebrimbor valiantly enduring torture to keep the rings from Sauron, while Ar-Pharazôn just sails straight for his demise. One more thing before I get to that, we'll also get to spend some time with Bob this season. This story will be interesting because it's the only storyline about a character who ages normally across this 50-year season. But basically, we get to see him spend his entire life fighting to free his people from the Nazgul, who've lost much of their sway since their master surrendered and left his empire leaderless. After all, Sauron styled himself as not just an emperor, but a god to his subjects. And since allowing himself to be carried away to Numenor, few of the people he conquered particularly fear him or his servants anymore. Thus, his empire begins to crumble without him, and our hero is able to rebuild it as its new king. In the first couple episodes, we see the men of the mountains beginning to turn on the Nazgul, who ultimately recognize they have no real power and flee. The next couple episodes, after the time jump, show a much older Bob struggling to keep his people united and root out those still loyal to Sauron, ultimately establishing himself as king of the mountains after a bloody conflict. We likely wouldn't focus quite as much on his story after the second time jump, but we'd see how much his kingdom has grown under his rule, while a small minority of Bob's people secretly maintains their loyalties to Sauron. All this should bring us to the last couple episodes of the season. Episode 7 would start with Ar-Pharazôn assembling his forces to sail against Valinor, while the faithful scramble to get the heck off the island and head to Middle-earth. Then the latter half of the episode is essentially an epic disaster movie, depicting the complete annihilation of Numenor in all its terrifying glory. Ar-Pharazôn's fleet is decimated, and the faithful just barely manage to scrounge up 9 ships in order to escape. The final episode would show Elendil and his sons arriving in Middle-earth, and probably have a few relatively small time jumps within the episode. We would see Gil-galad offer Elendil much of Eriador in which to establish a new kingdom, which he calls Arnor, while Isildur and Anarion travel south to establish their own kingdom just outside the borders of Mordor to keep an eye on Sauron's activities. As they begin to found Gondor, they encounter the people of a now quite old King Bob. Though he is extremely reluctant to once more kneel to outsiders, Bob is ultimately convinced to ally with them for their protection from Sauron should he return, as Isildur warns he might. He and his people then swear a magical oath of fealty, one we probably saw the Nazgul force their people to make to Sauron back in Season 1, invoking dark or at least mysterious powers to bind their very souls to their liege lord, that should they ever fail to uphold their oath of service, their souls should not rest, even in death, till they atone and fulfill their oath. So, yeah, if you weren't sure what the point of the subplot was the whole time, it was setting up the backstory for the Oathbreakers, aka the Dead Men of Dun Harrow. The last scene of the season finale is likely of Sauron's spirit returning to Mordor and creating a new body, calling the Nazgul to him once again as he prepares to rebuild his power. Season 4 begins about 100 years after the end of Season 3, by far the biggest time jump in the show. I definitely have the least to say about the events of this season, but it begins as the elves and men become aware that Sauron is definitely stirring and preparing for war inside Mordor. Most of the season is about Gondor trying to gauge Sauron's power, doing reconnaissance and engaging in relatively small battles, learning far too late just how great his forces truly are. In the latter half of the season, Sauron unleashes his full power on Gondor, driving the Dunedain north into Arnor and the Men of the Mountains into the Dwemerberg, their stronghold deep in the White Mountains. The latter were prevented from coming to Gondor's aid thanks to the small faction among them secretly loyal to Sauron, who caused a bloody conflict among them right when Gondor needed them most. Their king, most likely Bob's grandson, dealt with the insurrection, but by that point they had already been greatly weakened, and the fight for Gondor appeared all but lost. So the king reluctantly chose to break his oaths to Isildur rather than lead his people to certain destruction. The final episode would show the Dunedain and the elves gathering to assemble the last alliance in defiance of Sauron. And finally, the 5th and final season adapts the War of the Last Alliance. This season would likely only be 6 episodes, where previous seasons were 8. Episode 1 would show the Alliance making the final preparations for war and marching to Mordor about 4 years after the end of the previous season. Episodes 2 and 3 would include the Battle of Dagorlad, outside the Black Gate, which would be an absolutely horrific sequence. I know 2 episodes is a lot for one battle, but it wasn't just one engagement that took place in a single day. It spanned 3 months. Episode 2 would take some time to build up to the battle itself before it erupts in an epic sequence, ending on a pretty grim note. Then Episode 3 would pick up months after the end of the previous episode, at which point everyone is thoroughly exhausted from virtually non-stop fighting. Then, over the course of the episode, thanks to daring strategy, sheer desperate bravery, and a lot of sacrifice, they finally achieve their victory and break through the Black Gate into Mordor. Episode 4 is sort of a calm before the storm, giving us a 7-year time jump. The Alliance has been laying siege to Barad-dûr for the better part of a decade, and people have largely been going about their normal lives in the massive military camp in Mordor. However, the leaders are becoming worried about what Sauron might be cooking, and most people just want the siege to end so they can go home. Thus, they begin to formulate a plan to lure Sauron out and end him once and for all. In Episode 5, they finalize this plan and put it into effect, whatever it is, and it works. The episode ends with Sauron making his grand entrance on the battlefield, and then Episode 6 begins with Sauron's duel with Gil-galad and Elendil, in which all 3 kill one another, and Isildur finishes the job by cutting the one ring from Sauron's fallen body. The rest of the episode is then a long epilogue, which shows us the recovery and growth of the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor over the next couple of years in the aftermath, gives us a glimpse of Isildur's gradually increasing obsession with the ring in that time, and ends with the Battle of Gladden Fields, in which the ring is lost in the Anduin. The final shot shows the One Ring slip from Isildur's finger and sink to the riverbed, where it lies as the voiceover speaks vaguely and prophetically about the future events of the Lord of the Rings. And finally, we see Deagle's hand reach down into the frame to scoop the ring from the silt before we cut to black. And there you have it. That is my summary of the show Amazon should have given us. With only a couple minor exceptions, I told this story entirely within the bounds of Tolkien's writings, proving that Amazon's creative liberties were not only entirely unnecessary, but exclusively detrimental to the show. And while I didn't bother researching everything that would or would not have been within Amazon's right to adapt, I believe they used just about all the same characters I did, so I don't see why they couldn't have told a more faithful story using them. But what do you think? Would you have been happy with this version of the story? What changes would you make? How does it compare to what we actually got? What would your ideal version of Rings of Power look like? I'm just here to kick off the discussion, so as always, let me know in the comments below. Until next time, just keep thinking out loud.